The darkness is absolute, save for the silk walls of your tent rippling in the mountain gale. Outside, 10,000 warriors sleep, ready to die at your whim. You are untouchable. You have razed cities that stood for 1,000 years. Emperors have knelt at your feet. But tonight, the silence feels wrong. It is too heavy. Your hand moves instinctively toward the dagger beneath your pillow, and your fingers brush against something cold. Not steel, something else, a folded parchment. Placed there while you slept, your heart stops. Because if someone could reach your pillow, they could have cut your throat just as easily. By the dying embers of the brazier, you unfold it with trembling hands and read 4 words in perfect script. We were here first. This was no legend. This was the reality for a Mongol general named Kitbuqa in the winter of 1256, deep in the Persian mountains. It happened because he made the fatal mistake of believing that the world's most feared army could intimidate everyone. The year was 1256. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They had destroyed dynasties that had ruled for millennia. They had burned libraries, emptied cities, rewritten the map of the known world. Their strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. Overwhelming force, absolute discipline, and calculated terror. When a city surrendered, they showed mercy. When a city resisted, they left nothing but ash and pyramids of skulls as warnings to the next target. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was military psychology perfected. After the first few massacres, entire regions surrendered without a single arrow being fired. But as the Mongol general Hulagu Khan led his armies deeper into Persia, preparing to crush the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, his scouts brought troubling reports. There was an enemy in these mountains, not an army, not a kingdom, something else entirely, an order that had operated in the shadows for over a century and a half, an organization that had perfected a form of warfare the Mongols had never encountered. They were called the Hashishin. History would remember them as the assassins. Before we dive deeper into this impossible war, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, because honestly, it amazes me every single day that a story from the mountains of medieval Persia can reach someone on the other side of the planet right now, centuries later. Their fortress was called Alamut, the Eagle's Nest, perched on a mountain crag over 2,000 meters high in the Elburz Range. It had stood unconquered since 1090, when a man named Hassan I Sabah took it not with siege engines or soldiers, but with words and patience. He had spent months converting the garrison from within, and when he finally arrived at the gates, the lord of the fortress discovered he no longer had allies. Hassan paid him for the castle, and the man simply left. Not a drop of blood was spilled. It was Hassan's first lesson to the world. The most perfect conquest is the one where your enemy hands you power willingly. From Alamut, Hassan built something revolutionary. He created a network of agents who were trained not just in combat, but in languages, customs, court manners, and the art of becoming invisible in plain sight. An assassin could spend years infiltrating an enemy's inner circle, becoming a trusted servant, a loyal advisor, a close friend. And then, when the order came from Alamut, that friend became death. But what made them truly terrifying was not just the killing, it was the message. They would place daggers on pillows while kings slept, leaving notes that read, "You could have been in that pillow." They would warn their targets before striking, sometimes weeks in advance, creating a psychological torment worse than any dungeon. They killed caliphs, viziers, crusader generals, anyone who threatened their independence. And they did it with such precision that rulers across the Islamic world and Christian Europe began to live in constant fear. Not fear of armies at their gates, but fear of the person standing beside them. Because an assassin required proximity, required trust, required looking into your victim's eyes. And that made every handshake, every shared meal, every moment of vulnerability a potential death sentence. The Mongols had faced countless enemies. Chinese armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, Russian principalities, Persian kingdoms, European knights. They had crushed them all with the same formula: mobility, discipline, and overwhelming force applied without hesitation or mercy. But the assassins did not field armies. They did not defend cities. They did not fight battles the Mongol way. They fought in corridors and shadows, in moments when armor was removed and guards were dismissed. How do you conquer an enemy who has no territory to take? How do you intimidate warriors who have spent decades perfecting the art of intimidation itself? This was the question that haunted Hulagu Khan as he received his orders from the great Khan Manji. Eliminate the assassins completely. No negotiations, no tribute. Total destruction. And so two philosophies of power, both perfected through centuries of refinement, moved toward collision. One believed that power came from the ability to reach anyone, anywhere, in their most vulnerable moment. The other believed power came from the will to destroy anything, regardless of cost, until nothing remained to resist. Both were masters of terror. Both had made entire civilizations tremble, but their methods were opposite in every conceivable way, and when they finally clashed, the world would discover something no strategist had anticipated: that visible terror and invisible terror, when they meet, create a kind of psychological warfare that transcends conventional battle entirely. The first assassination happened on a night when the mountain wind carried the scent of coming snow. General Kitbuqa, cousin to Hulagu himself and commander of one of the Mongol advance columns, was found in his tent with his throat open and a single precise cut. The guards had heard nothing, seen nothing. There had been no alarm, no struggle, no disturbance of any kind. The assassin had entered a heavily guarded Mongol military camp, killed one of their most senior commanders, and vanished like smoke. Beside the body lay a small scroll with a symbol the Mongols were beginning to recognize: the mark of the order. For the first time in decades of conquest, Mongol soldiers felt something unfamiliar. Not fear of battle, they had never feared that, but fear of vulnerability. Fear that the man sleeping next to you, the one who had ridden beside you for months, might not be who he claimed. Fear that death could come not with the thunder of hooves and the clash of swords, but in silence, in darkness, from hands you trusted. Hulag's response revealed everything about Mongol military psychology. He did not increase his personal security. He did not retreat. He did not negotiate. Instead, he executed every guard who had been on duty that night, not for treason, but for incompetence. Then he sent a message back to the assassins, not in words, but in action. He ordered every village within 50 kilometers of the nearest assassin fortress to be razed. Thousands of Persian civilians, most of whom had nothing to do with the order, were killed in systematic massacres. The message was brutally clear: for every Mongol who dies, 100 Persians will die. It does not matter if they are assassins or not. Terror works in both directions. The assassins responded with more killings. Officers were found dead in their tents. Scouts disappeared on mountain trails. Even common soldiers, when isolated, became targets. But something unexpected began to happen within the Mongol army. These warriors, who had faced Chinese legions and Russian winters without flinching, began to show signs of a different kind of strain. Not cowardice in battle, but a corrosive paranoia that ate at unit cohesion. Soldiers began watching each other, questioning each other. One Mongol commander wrote in a letter that was later discovered, "We defeated 100,000 Chinese and slept peacefully afterward." Here, surrounded by empty mountains, no one truly sleeps, because the enemy might already be inside, beside us, waiting. The assassins had achieved something unprecedented. They had made the Mongols experience personal, individual fear. Not strategic concern, not tactical caution, but the primitive terror of unexpected death from a trusted hand. And they had done it by infiltrating the Mongol forces themselves. Not in large numbers, but enough. Agents posing as captured auxiliaries, as merchants selling supplies, as translators and guides. Just enough to make everyone suspect everyone. Hulagu responded with purges. Anyone suspected of infiltration was publicly executed. The problem was that this created its own destructive cycle. Soldiers began denouncing each other, sometimes from genuine suspicion, sometimes to eliminate rivals or settle personal scores. The cohesion that had made the Mongols so effective began to fracture from within. But the assassins were also bleeding. Every smaller fortress that fell was a loss of irreplaceable resources and trained personnel. The Mongols had cut supply routes. Fortresses that depended on external trade for food began rationing. And most critically, the Mongol reprisals were turning the Persian population against the order. Families who had quietly supported the assassins for generations now begged them to stop, because every assassination was answered with massacres of innocents. In the spring of 1254, the Mongols captured their first living assassin after a brutal siege of a minor fortress. Under days of interrogation that broke him in ways training had not prepared him for, he revealed the locations of several infiltration cells. The purge that followed was merciless. Hulagu executed over 2,000 people in his army, many certainly innocent, but among them were enough real agents that the intelligence reached Alamut within days. The order's leadership realized something devastating, that terror, however effective, could not stop an enemy willing to sacrifice his own people to advance. That invisible power had limits when facing visible brutality without restraint. Rukn al-Din Kursha, the Grand Master of the Order, watched from Alamut as the outer ring of fortresses fell one by one. Mehmed-Diz, Lamassar each lasted weeks, then collapsed under Mongol siege engines hauled up mountain paths that seemed impossible to traverse. And each time a fortress fell, Hulagu made certain the defenders of Alamut could see the smoke rising from their sister strongholds. By the autumn of 1256, Alamut stood alone, completely isolated, surrounded by a Mongol army that had brought Chinese engineers and siege equipment to positions in the surrounding mountains. Warriors who had conquered half the world now stared at the last symbol of assassin power, and they were patient. They had learned, painfully, that this enemy required different methods, not just overwhelming force but systematic isolation, not just military pressure but psychological attrition. And time, the Mongols had time. Alamet did not. In November, the first siege engines began launching stones from the surrounding peaks. They did little structural damage. The fortress was too well built, but they achieved something else. They created constant noise, constant threat, the impossibility of rest. And then Rukn al-Din made the decision that would end the order as a political and military force forever. He decided to negotiate. His emissaries descended from Alamet carrying an offer. He would surrender personally, travel to Karakorum to present himself before the great Khan, and in exchange he asked only for the lives of Alamet's inhabitants to be spared. Not the order's continuation, not his own power, just mercy for those who had followed him. Hulagu accepted, but with Mongol conditions. Rukn al-Din had to come immediately. He had to order every remaining fortress to surrender. He had to deliver all treasures and archives. The Grand Master agreed. On a cold December morning in 1256, he descended from the fortress that had never fallen and presented himself to Hulagu Khan. What happened next revealed the true nature of Mongol conquest. Hulagu received him with apparent respect, offered food, spoke of safe passage to the great Khan. But his engineers were already inside Alamet, cataloging everything. The legendary library of Hisani-Sabah, containing irreplaceable texts on philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and history, was systematically burned. The fortress that had stood for 166 years was demolished stone by stone, not to be occupied, not to be garrisoned, but to be erased, to leave no symbol for future resistance to rally around. Rukn al-Din watched it all from Mongol custody, understanding too late that there had never been terms to negotiate, only the manner of destruction to determine. They took him east, supposedly to meet the great Khan. He never arrived. Somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia, and circumstances deliberately left vague in Mongol records, the last Grand Master of Alamet was executed. Some accounts say he was kicked to death. Others say he was strangled. The method hardly mattered. The result was absolute. By the spring of 1257, the Order of the Assassins as a centralized military and political force had ceased to exist. The fortresses were ruins. The network was shattered. Agents who had operated across the Islamic world found themselves without leadership, without refuge, without purpose. Some became bandits. Others disappeared into the general population, carrying their training and secrets into anonymous graves. The organization that had terrorized caliphs and crusader kings, that had made political assassination into an art form, that had proven a small group with precision and patience could alter the course of empires, had been destroyed in less than 3 years, not by matching their tactics, not by infiltrating their network, but by applying a level of systematic brutality that made their own methods seem almost restrained by comparison. Hulagu had learned the assassin's central lesson and inverted it. They had proven that killing the right person at the right moment could change history. He proved that killing enough people, regardless of who they were, could eliminate any resistance entirely. It was the victory of visible terror over invisible terror, of overwhelming force over surgical precision, of an enemy who valued objectives over individual lives against an enemy whose entire strategy depended on making individual lives matter absolutely. But here's what the Mongols could not destroy: the idea. Fragments of the assassin tradition survived in Syria, where some fortresses eventually negotiated their own terms with the Mamluks. The Nizari Ismaili community, the religious foundation from which the assassins had emerged, continues to exist today, though without the militant structure Hassan-i-Sabbah created. And the concept itself, the notion that a small, dedicated group operating in shadows could exert influence far beyond their numbers through carefully targeted violence, became a template studied by revolutionaries, resistance movements, and intelligence services for centuries to come. The structure Hassan developed decentralized cells, sleeper agents building false identities over years, the separation of strategic leadership from tactical operators. All of this echoes through modern covert operations. Even the word assassin itself, derived from Hashishin, became part of every language, a permanent linguistic legacy of those mountain fortresses and the men who made silence into a weapon. The Mongols won the war, absolutely, but the assassins won something else. They won memory. 7 centuries later, we remember Alamut more vividly than most Mongol victories. We remember Hassan-i-Sabbah's name more readily than the generals who destroyed his creation. The fortress is gone, but the legend of invisible warriors who could reach anyone became more enduring than any stone. There is a final irony worth contemplating. Hulagu destroyed the assassins, then continued to destroy the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, one of the great centers of human civilization. The Mongol Empire seemed invincible in 1260, but within a century it had fragmented into rival khanates. Within 2 centuries it had largely dissolved. The force that seemed unstoppable proved temporary. The idea that seemed defeated proved permanent. So who really won? If victory is measured in immediate military terms, the answer is obvious and absolute. The Mongols erased their enemy from the earth. But if victory is measured in historical resonance in the survival of ideas in which force shaped human behavior for centuries after, the answer becomes less certain. What is certain is this: the war between the Mongols and the assassins demonstrated something fundamental about power, that there is no single form of force that always prevails, that visible armies and invisible networks are both potent and both vulnerable, that terror is a weapon that cuts both directions, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing is not the enemy you can see or the threat you cannot, but the moment when both exist simultaneously, when every shadow might hide a blade and every open field might hide an army, when paranoia becomes rational and trust becomes suicide. The ruins of Alamut still stand in the mountains of Iran, weathered stones on a remote crag that few visit. The wind that whistles through those broken walls carries no answers, only echoes, of men who believed they could change the world with a dagger and patience, of warriors who believed they could conquer anything with enough brutality and will. Both were right, both were wrong, and the mountains remember both with the same indifferent silence they have always kept, watching empires rise and fall, watching philosophies of power clash and fade, holding their secrets as they have for centuries, as they will for centuries more.